Okay, so I think this will actually be the third tutorial I've made in this playlist, and the initial two videos were about using a volume builder to build a structure, a vessel, the pot, cup, however you want to look at it, for a 3D prototype extruder. And I'm still learning about this process. I obviously am the software person, but amazing colleague, Vaughn, a faculty member here at Texas Tech University, who's doing stuff with the extruder, and I'm still learning what that software does. And in the first couple tutorials, I was using a volume builder with the idea that maybe we would need an inside and outside. Turns out, like, the way the extruder works, it generally doesn't do the bottom, like it doesn't fill it in. It basically just does the side, so I can make kind of a hollow tube here. Let me pull up that image again. So, in this brainstorming, Vaughn and I have been looking at various ways to make the form. So here's actually a lofted surface using these kind of rounded rectangles to make this quite beautiful form. This has come out of this extruder. Vaughn sent me this picture. Thanks, Vaughn. So I'm just continuing to experiment with, like, how could we construct things in various ways. So I'm just providing some basic overview of the software itself. So I worked up an example. I'm just showing this now, and then I'm going to go through and try to recreate some of the things, or something similar, I guess, to some of these concepts. But I made two different objects. I started with the idea of what we could do with Lathe, which is pretty, this is kind of like the equivalent of what you would do on the wheel. And then maybe how you could take some of those parts and make a different type of form that somewhat adheres to that. But in this case, we'd use Loft, and we're going to use this fancy little cloner item in this, and also add some deformers so we can twist and taper and bulge certain sections. Because I'm really curious about the idea of not using an extruder just to simply replicate what we could do on the wheel. Like, this would be kind of the wheel-like form. I think the wheel works pretty good in ceramics, but, and I'm no ceramicist, the carves and cuts and this change in form, that would be difficult, right? That's not something you're going to easily do on the wheel. So you'd probably have to carve that after the fact. So this is where the extruder maybe starts to excel. So I'm interested in the connection between the two, and what works good in one format we should use the wheel, and where the wheel maybe doesn't work, let's use these other new technologies to make similar but different forms. All right, I'm already 3 minutes into this tutorial and I'm pontificating. My apologies. All right, so let's just start with a new scene and go from there. So just keep these forms in mind. All right, so I'm going to go to my 4 views, and in the previous tutorials, I created an object, and let me just zoom in a little bit here. I created a spline, right? One of these prefab, like rectangles here, right? And I oriented it along the Y direction here, and I duplicated that, and we lofted a surface. So we're going to come back to that. But another way to create a surface within Cinema 4D with one of these objects instead of Loft is Lathe. Now, I'm still exploring, like, how we might use that in different ways, but you'll see how this kind of flows as we go along. So the whole idea with Lathe, there's some caveats to this, but at the very beginning, just always use the front view when you do what we're about to do. So what I'm going to do is draw a curve. And when I draw it, I'm going to draw it in the front view, and I'm going to draw it on the positive X side, right? So I'm going to treat this as the middle. So I'm going to just draw a profile that's out here, and then we'll use the lathe to spin it around. So this is like, what that profile would look if you want to think like what you wanted your final pot or vessel to look like, right? And how you would shape it on the wheel. This will be the equivalent. So, so let's grab the pen tool, and I could do a separate, and probably will, tutorial about all the different tools I clicked on it, but I haven't started drawing in the screen. There's a Bezier style, so as I click and drag, I can put these points in here. I can change this also to B-spline. So this doesn't have any handles, but it uses math to basically figure out where the rounding is and wherever I want more rounding to take place, I put the points kind of further away from each other, right? I'll just hit escape. I'm going to draw actually one that I think would be more appropriate for this. So let's see, maybe I will do some little floating thing here. I'm just clicking. All right. I don't like that form. Let me do it again. Let's do more just the standard pot like I did before. Okay, I'll call that good. Probably too many points in there, and hit escape to get out of that. So in this object, I can go into a component mode. So at the top here, this is the point mode, the edge mode, and the face mode. There are no faces in this object at this point. So I can just use the face mode and click and drag. Right, to move these along. Oops. Right, to kind of reposition them if I need to. There's some other better tools for quickly moving and dragging things around, but I'm not going to get into that. Let's just keep this kind of clean. All right, so let's just say that's the profile that I want to use. And let's go in and use the lathe. Oops. So it's in this generator, the top of the green buttons here. The generator is for how to generate lots of different surfaces. This other one's generating surface through that crazy, it's kind of the wild card one. And then we'll have the cloner section down in here. But we want lathe. So this is this one. And in standard Cinema 4D practice, when we want to generate something, these green items, when you use one of those, what it wants is for an object to be a child of it, to generate the form, right? So I put this profile, this curve in here that says, hey, this is the outer edge of this thing. I'm gonna move this down just a little bit so I can get it right there on the floor, so to speak, right? And you can see I have made this groovy little shape. It's not a bad form. You could do this on the wheel, obviously, and that's probably the best place maybe to do that. So in experimenting, what I wanted to do is figure out how could I add changes to the surface, keeping in mind that this is hollow with the bottom and the top, and it's just paper thin, right? It doesn't have a thickness, but I think that's the way the prototyper, as I currently understand it for the clay, works best. I will certainly experiment with that, Vaughn and I, as we go forward. But what I'd like to do is maybe have a variety of profiles. So what if I called this the base spline? Base plus spline? I want base underscore is what I want. All right, so this would be the base spline. What if I could take that and modify it so that as it went around the surface, it would change, right? So let's just imagine that I had, oops, let's go into this front view again. So let's duplicate this base spline. So I have base spline number 0.1. And inside of here, I'm just going to change this just a little bit along the surface. Okay, I'm going to call that good. I'm going to keep this the same, but I want it to change. So if I put this in the lathe and it's going around, it's using this spline here to generate the surface, but it doesn't understand how to take multiple splines into account to position them, right? So it gives me no option for this, right? So if you're a Cinema 4D person, you might be like, oh yeah, Lathe, but that doesn't give me the option. And of course, this is what I ran into. I was like, well, how's a different way that I could alternate maybe between these profiles so the surface went in and out, or varied, right? So I had a kind of carving into that. So the answer for this is something called a cloner. And I'm going to have to demonstrate really quickly, maybe in a separate file. So let me come back to this one, and I'm just going to create a cube, right, in this scene. And I'm going to create this cloner object. And it's the third of the generators down here. You can see it looks like a bunch of spheres being duplicated across a cube, right, this object. And I'm just going to put the cube inside the cloner. And let's make the cubes smaller. Let's make it 20 by 20 by 20, right? So you can see I now have 9 different cubes. And when I changed the shape of just one of them, the prototype for this, right, the thing being cloned, it changed all of them, because the cloner is a way of distributing copies around the in these patterns. So if I go into the cloner underneath its object settings, almost as always, right? Basic and coordinate, I think I explained before, these are common to almost every object. But underneath the object, these are the instructions for what the cloner does. And it says, hey, the cloning mode is grid. What if we just did radial, right? So now inside of this, if I work my way around, just forget some of this other stuff for now, but the count is 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the radius is 50 centimeters. Let's go ahead and increase that, and let's make this 24. So you can see I have 24 cubes working around. This almost looks a little bit like the lathe, right? A little foreshadowing. So let's create a sphere, actually, and let's make the sphere a similar size, right? That radius at 20. And let's put this in there with the cube, right? So now what we can see is there are 2 objects in the clone. As a default, the clone is type, there's radial, and the type of clones is to iterate. And iterate just means go in increments, right? So this is like a list. So this is item number 1, this is item number 2. Actually, it would count it as 0 and 1, because that's the way the computer counts, but this is item number 1, number 2, item 1, number 2. We could also tell it to be random. So it would randomly move through the objects that I've put into the cloner, right? I could duplicate it, so I get more. I could get more versions of spheres appearing, right? So these are the exact same spheres, but if the clone is randomly sampling through 1 cube and 3 spheres, you're going to end up with more spheres. If I go back to the cloner and I say, you know what, let's go back to iterate. So I'll get 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, right? So this is a pattern as it works around that, the radius. So let's go back to this. So instead of a lathe, let's go ahead and use that cloner, and instead of using spheres and cubes, let's use these fancy profile curves that I've set up. Now, keep in mind that I drew this, as I said at the very beginning, I did it in the front view. So they're all oriented flat in this front view. They actually, you can see it right here on the surface, right? It's right there along that surface. It's perfectly along the x-axis. It's highlighted here. So this is somewhat important, how the placement is. I'm not going to get into talking about where the transform is and all this other stuff, but that shouldn't really matter. So let's create the cloner. Let's just see what Dane's talking about here, right? So let's put both of those into the cloner, and let's just delete the lathe. And as a default, you can see I have these various clones, and you can see they're slightly different from each other, right? Remember, I changed the stuff that's down here at the bottom. so that I got a similar, it's always the same at the top, but it varies down here at the bottom. So I've put this into a clone. Of course, this doesn't seem to map onto our idea of the vessel very well, because again, as a default, it's in a grid mode. Let's put it in radial mode. And it says 5. What if we make this, let's make this 12 copies. Right? So you can see, oh, that's interesting. Oh, so they're slightly offset from each other. This is a little more complicated to explain. It has to do with where the pivot point for this is in relationship to the radius of the clone. So let's put that at 0. So instead of trying to offset it, we've already kind of drawn an offset into that shape. When I drew it away from the center. Let's turn off the cloner, right? I drew it away from the center line so that when it spins around and creates that radial pattern, it doesn't have to move them away from the center. I've already done that. I drew it away from the center to start with. Hopefully that makes sense. That's a little confusing for like an intro if you're not used to it. But if you're like, I have no idea what he's talking about, when you draw these profiles, make sure you do it in the front view, do it on the positive X side. When you draw it, it will just be flat. When you manipulate it, always do it in this view. And then we'll go into the cool 3D space and we'll turn the cloner on, right? So what the cloner does is it creates copies, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It creates 12 of these. And hopefully you can see that they're varying across that surface, right? Well, if you remember from the previous tutorials, we can create a surface through a loft where I say, hey, go from this curve to that curve to that curve. Well, the cloner's created a whole bunch of curves for us to do that, so it still applies. Let's go to the loft and let's just put the cloner, which is a way of generating a whole bunch of curves, which the loft is pretty cool with. And now I get a new surface. You can see how it's changing and undulating. Now, it has a hole in it. We'll just go to the loft and tell it to be a loop so it finishes that pattern off right there, right? So this is pretty good. I mean, it's not bad. It doesn't, the undulations, it's nice and smooth here, but we're not really seeing it down at the bottom. And for the loft, or the cloner, this is great because it's all generative, so I can experiment. So right now the count is 12, and it's, you know, if I take the loft off, it's gradually modifying from this shape to that one, to this shape to that one. So it's kind of gently doing that. If I decrease the distance, it will change the amount, it will increase the amount of change that happens between each of these little segments, right? So let's go into the cloner, and instead of 12, let's tell it to be 36. Okay. So now I have all these sides, and if I turn on the loft, you can see I'm getting that ribbed pattern in there. Now, it's a little boxy NB, so we can see where the detail is. And in the case of the loft right now, it's doing this interpolation based on how these, the type of interpolation that's on the spline. I could tell these to be uniform. I think it works that way. The other thing is within the loft, I can just increase the subdivisions here, right? So the more I put in this, let's just put it up nice and high so we get a really smooth, nice and clean shape, right? So already this is kind of nice. Where am I at? 18 minutes. Okay. So this will probably be the end of this part of the tutorial. So the more I put in here, the tighter it gets between where we'll call this, you know, between base. This is like the outer and the innie, you know, like it kind of changes between that. The other thing I'll add to this is if you, let's make sure our cloner is set to iterate. Yeah. So if I take this one and duplicate it, and I'm going to duplicate this one. So now what's happening is it does this one and then this one and then moves to this one and then this one. So as it creates these copies, let's turn off the loft again, right? So you can see down in here, well, let's go. It's hard to look at, I guess, if you want to think of it. Let's go to the, this is the best way to kind of look at it. There are 1, 2, 1, 2. You can see where it kind of loops in right there. And then 1, 2. Again, let's just, I don't know, 48. So we'll decrease, and so this time we'll get more of those, but they're more pronounced, I guess, because of these duplicates that I've put in here. Let's make sure I get the right one. And as they get closer together, you can see you get now more kind of a carved out, because it goes 1, 2, 3 of the base one. And then it transitions to 1, 2, 3 of the inner, right? And so now I get these patterns inside of that, right? I don't know, let's do 96. Okay. So it's doing all the interpolation, right? In between the sections, it's trying to smoothly move between them. But because there's so many of them now, it has to quickly go between the inner section and the outer section. Right? So you can create these kind of grooves and let the computer transition between the one that I pulled in and the one that I pulled out, right? And again, these are, I guess, maybe another way to look at this. In fact, you can see it here, right? You can see where the inner and the outer, I'm getting this kind of weird burst. There's something else I wanted to say here. Yeah, already that's pretty cool. I like how it's cutting into that shape, but that everything comes back to a nice smooth thing. So this is a blend of what you could do on the wheel, and then this is a little different. Probably not what you want to try to do on the wheel. And we can also experiment with the cloner because it's iterate, right? It's going through the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so I get even distribution of this. What if I said randomly move in between that? Right? And I get more of an organic pattern across. Right? So some of these are smaller, bigger. We get these bigger, wide open. And the thing that's really cool about this is if you don't like the distribution, it has a little seed value. You can say, oh, I like that random. Oh, I like that it's random, but not that random. So you can change the which randomization it's using inside of here. So this is all very generative. And iterative, right? Where I can try options and I haven't destroyed anything. I could go back and make all kinds of changes to the form itself. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at iterate because when I come back in tutorial number 2, I want to see what I can do with the deformers to kind of modify the surface a little bit. All right, see you in a bit.